Stanford University.
Okay, let's get started. We pick up with aggression, competition, etc. And where have we gotten to? We are now just about to leap to, instead of early environment, early hormonal exposure, perinatal, hormones both before and after birth. Around that time, what do they have to do with adult behavior in these realms? So again, this is tapping into that same concept from the sex lectures, organizational hormonal effects versus activational. Organizational early in life, setting up the nervous system to respond later on to some sort of activational hormonal effect. So the basic theme that's come through with the animal studies here has been built around, what if you have females who are prenatally or perinatally androgenized, exposed to high testosterone levels? And what you see is basically the exact same thing as from the sex lectures, which is you get a powerful masculinization, organizational masculinization effect. So that later on, these are females who respond to even their low levels of testosterone in the bloodstream with increased levels of aggression, more aggressive play, bunch of measures like that, less maternal behavior when having offspring. A pretty clear literature in terms of prenatal masculinization of aggressive behavior as well as sexual behavior. So, as usual, what about humans? And we go back to our two diseases from the other week. One was that congenital adrenal hyperplasia business, that tumor in the mother that produces vast amounts of, among other things, an androgen, a testosterone derivative, which androgenizes the fetus. Or the case with that drug DES, diethylstilbestrol, where some women in the 50s took them for preventing miscarriage, and in some cases had androgenic effects. Back to the same issue as with the sex lectures. So what's the behavior of these individuals like? And again, people were all over that one. People were really interested in this. Both of them kind of burst on the scene, congenital adrenal hyperplasia and the DES babies, around the same time. Lots of people started studying these kids as they started growing up with the very simple question here of, are they going to be more aggressive than typical girls? And ultimately, will they be more aggressive women? And somewhere between the lines, they're also asking the question, are they going to be more aggressive than is normal for a typical girl? So what began to come out of these studies? First off, some interesting, odd, quirky things. One is when you androgenize a female fetus, human, and later on, as a child, she will have a higher than average IQ. Whoa, that's kind of interesting. Stay tuned. It turns out that's not at all interesting. Okay, so that was observed. Another thing, more of a tendency towards being left-handed, better spatial skills, and both of those are attributes that are more common among males than females. What else? But that's all that sort of stuff having to do with ancillary issues. But now finally, people were then really focusing in on the issues of aggression. And by the time these girls were, 10, 12 years old or so, the findings were absolutely clear. These kids were way, way more aggressive than normal. How do you know? Because they were less interested in playing with dolls than normal girls, because they expressed less interest in marriage, because they expressed more interest in having a career someday. So these were obviously over-the-top, rabid, psychopathic, androgenized females, because they weren't normal. They weren't interested in dolls or marriage, and were interested in a career. This was in every textbook starting in the late 60s, and was still there in textbooks by the mid-80s or so, endocrinology textbooks, and somewhere in the early 70s or so, probably some male endocrinologists kind of discovered that, wanting a career if you're female does not count as aggression. Actually, they came up with an even better term, assertive dominance. How's that for a term that just summarizes an entire worldview of gender differences? Okay, so some male endocrinologists finally figured that out, or maybe actually there finally started being some female endocrinologists who pointed out this was gibberish. The entire literature went down the tubes, had to be started all over. Oh, wanting a career is not being assertively, dominantly aggressive if you're female. So back to stage one on that whole literature, lots of work since then. What the literature has generally shown is the left-handedness is there. The spatial issues seem to remain. The IQ, the higher IQ is there. What's up with that? All that's known is, as an explanation, you find an equivalently higher IQ in the parents. So it's got nothing to do with the androgenization. There's some sort of selection going on, perhaps who winds up being in a study like this, sort of more educated families, who knows what, but that one turned out to be a red herring. What about aggression? Because now there's been populations of androgenized girls who are now well into adulthood. What about antisocial behavior? What about all those sorts of things? And in general, what is shown is there's not much going on. The literature has been pretty ambiguous in terms of any sort of trends there of different behaviors, different attitudes, different motivations, etc. in these folks as they grow up. But suppose what you found was, as adults, women who had been androgenized as fetuses were now 17 times more likely to start brawls in bar rooms, to snipe at people from the tops of water towers, things of that sort. What would you conclude? Ooh, prenatal testosterone makes you more aggressive as an adult. No. Same confound with these folks as from the sex lectures the other week, which is these girls were not just born having been exposed to lots of testosterone in utero and doing something or other to their brain. They were born with basically a hermaphroditic profile of genitals that looked like males, or intersex, sexually ambiguous genitals. These were the kids who went through a dozen rounds of reconstructive surgery in their first half dozen years of life, their first 10 years of life, in this part of the body that everyone's interested in but doesn't quite talk about, and what's up with that, and why aren't I normal? And these, once again, were not girls who grew up with the only thing being different about them, their prenatal hormone exposure. Basically makes the whole literature uninterpretable. So what else in terms of prenatal hormone effects? Another literature that people have looked at, which in principle could be extremely informative, looking at dizygotic twins, non-identical twins. So you are a girl, you're a dizygotic twin, and you can have a sibling who is either a sister or a brother. In other words, you may have spent your time in utero with your sibling who either did or did not secrete a certain amount of testosterone during that time. Do you see any sort of masculinization of aspects of aggressive behavior in girls who are dizygotic twins with a male sibling rather than a female one? And what you wind up seeing is these kids, individuals, show on the average more aggressive play in childhood. More, here's the jargony term, more rough and tumble play, more interest in cars, mechanical things like that, less interest in stuffed animals, in dolls. Small effect, very small effect. Nonetheless, it suggests that this is another realm where a little bit of prenatal exposure to testosterone will change the behavioral profile. Except there's a confound in these studies, which is if you were a girl and you have an identical twin who is a boy, you are in the Guinness Book of Records. Okay, let's start that one. If you are a girl and you have a non-identical twin, that's how it works. Okay, I knew I should have checked the notes before coming. So you got a non-identical twin who's a boy. Not only do you spend your prenatal environment being awash in some of his dribbling hormones, but you grow up with him. And girls who grow up with boys as brothers as opposed to plants as brothers, because, whoa, what is happening here? Okay, being a girl, growing up with brothers increases the likelihood of rough and tumble play, because that's what you do with your brother. Once again, uninterpretable literature. Generally, what you see is very, very clear-cut androgenization of aggressive behavior, prenatal testosterone when you're looking at rodents. By the time you're looking at primates, some pretty strong patterns, but nowhere near as dramatic as in the rodent species looked at. By the time you look at humans, maybe just some hints, but that at the most. One of the most interesting realms, literatures, where people have been thinking about prenatal testosterone exposure is work of a guy in the UK at Oxford named Simon Baron-Cohen. And what he is basically the world's expert on autism. And he has developed what is called the hyper-male hypothesis of autism. For starters, there's a very, very big gender skew in autism, far more frequent among boys than girls, among males than females. And what Baron-Cohen has done a lot of work on over the years is first looking at a whole array of sex differences between normal human males and females, sex differences, some of it's the finger ratio stuff, some of it is neuroanatomy, some of those structural differences in the brain having to do with that, some of it is functional spatial skills versus language skills, some of it is problem solving, and there is sort of a gender difference that tends to come through with that on the average, blah, blah, in that boys, males, men, take more analytical approaches to social problem solving, girls, women, females take more empathic ones. So that's a difference. Okay, so he studied all sorts of stuff like that, and obviously with hormones as well, all sorts of really subtle, interesting physical differences, whole array of these. And what he has shown is that individuals with autism, regardless of their sex, tend to have even more exaggerated versions of those male typical profiles. The finger length, the analytical focus at the cost of social empathy, social affiliation, the very strong spatial skills, whole bunch of those. So he's made a fairly convincing argument, I think, that is good, something's going on in terms of prenatal androgenization, perhaps, which produces a more masculinized profile, which taken to its extreme winds up being autism. In other words, normal male behavior is just skating on thin ice before going into this whole realm of sort of dysfunctional socialization. Lots of stuff with that, as we'll see next week, some very interesting differences in the wiring of the cortex of people with autism, and males show that same thing, just not as extreme. Okay, interesting footnote thing. Simon Baron-Cohen is apparently the cousin of Sacha Baron Cohen of Borat, which suggests that must be one interesting family when they get together for the holidays. Okay, moving back one more box. However, no, I'm not going to do that. Okay, moving back one more box. Now, instead of perinatal hormone stuff, early environment, what about genes? What about genes? What do genes have to do with aggression, competition, cooperation, empathy, etc.? It used to be, not that long ago, if you even raised the possibility that there were genetic elements to aggression, you would be hounded out of certain realms of social science. It was viewed as wildly incorrect, wildly offensive, hidden agendas out the wazoo. For some reason, this began to pass in the early 90s or so. There were studies in the mid-80s, conferences in the mid-80s, where there were protests, they were picketed, because in this meeting that was considering the sociology of aggression, the this of aggression, the biology, the genetics, the inclusion of it was the grounds for the picketing. A number of those were canceled by the National Institutes of Health under public pressure of certain interest groups, all of that. It used to be viewed as outrageously offensive, the notion that genes have anything to do with aggression. So there's two ways of showing that that's wrong. The first is to sit somebody down and make them go through the last 15 lectures in this class, or the other is to reflect on the fact that you would leave like a 3-year-old in the care of a basset hound, but not with a pit bull. oh, there are breed-specific differences in behavior. That, if nothing else, is a demonstration of it, that dog breeds have been bred for 20,000 years or so to differ in levels of aggression, in levels of affiliation, all of that. People who, for some bizarre reason, follow bullfighting, there are lines of bulls, different ranches in Spain and Mexico, where they have been famous for centuries for the particular fighting style of the bulls that they breed their children. Genes have something to do with it. Of course they do, because hormones have something to do with it. And because receptors and because enzymes and everything with that, it is impossible to have talked about any of the stuff on the far right of the chart without invoking genes. A ludicrous view. So what is known about the relevance of genes to aspects of aggressive behavior? First off, at this stage, there's been a whole bunch of studies, many of them winding up in some very visible journals, where people find a gene implicating it in abnormal levels of aggression, one of those sorts of behaviors. Typical strategy, these might be genetically engineered animals to remove that gene, or there might be a spontaneous mutation. And all of these report that these are animals with a whole bunch of these mutations, that these are animals with abnormally high levels of aggression. That's kind of a clean experiment. If you go in and thanks to a mutation or chopping out one particular gene and now you've got a lot more aggression in that individual, that kind of suggests that that gene has something to do with aggression, perhaps a whole lot. What are all the problems with that? Other ways that that gene could be affecting behavior, which indirectly winds up getting to aggression. One possibility, what if that's a gene that is relevant to impulsivity? And this is an individual who, if you gave the mouse a different realm of tests, would be shouting its love to the world at an impulsively high rate, just as it's being aggressive at an impulsively high rate. Maybe it's a gene having to do with impulsivity. Maybe it's a gene having to do with one of the things we heard in the last lecture. What are the environmental releasing stimuli that cause aggression to occur? What's one of the most reliable ones? Pain. Oh, it turned out a number of these strains of mice that were identified with a gene knockout, that here's a gene which can cause aggression. It turned out that these were genes that made animals that were much more sensitive to pain. And they were more likely in a pain state to displace aggression onto something else. Or, as was shown in some of these were animals who were more aggressive, but they were also more affiliative, and they were more everything. Their just level of arousal, their generic level of arousal, was a lot higher. So all these caveats, an awful lot of the genes that popped up in the first generation of those sorts of studies that looked solid, that were replicated, a lot of them instead had to do with indirect routes rather than directly with aggression itself. So what about the genes that have held up? And the really plausible candidate ones, we've covered some of these already, the serotonin synthesis genes and the serotonin receptor genes and the dopamine receptor genes. All of those have been very solidly implicated. Really careful research, the molecular biologists teaming up with behaviorists who knew what they were doing. Genetic components. And what you know by now that it's absolutely about is this figure again. That's the case with all of these genes. Oh my God, it's not genes causing aggression. We know exactly this one, modulation, all that stuff, again, depending on the environment, and the environment in the realm of genes relevant to aggression, the environment is overwhelmingly about abuse and stress early in life. So that's about as far as the genes will get you there, which is plenty good because this is exactly how the genes should be relevant to behavior. This is how all genes are relevant to behavior. Remember our ultimate punchline from the behavior genetics. At the end of the day, it actually doesn't make any sense to ever say what any gene does, only what it does in the following range of environments. In terms of that, what you are beginning to find is this still sort of growing field which is beginning to look at differences in these genotypes, these different versions of these genes in different populations, in different cultures. And that's just beginning as a literature. I'm not impressed enough with the findings yet that it's worth passing them on, but that is going to be a very interesting field. Finally, there's always this puzzle with any of these of, oh, you've got some gene that's predisposing you towards being aggressive if you were abused in childhood. We still know nothing in terms of that gene. That gene's got no predictive power as to whether this will thus be someone who grows up and is a sociopathic murderer, or if this is someone who grows up and is just an unbelievably nasty Monopoly player. That factor again, that same deal, ooh, major frontal cortical damage, disinhibition, you can't regulate your behavior. No science in terms of the neurobiology as to why one turns into a serial murderer and the other one who doesn't catch clues that the family wants to eat dinner. Again, it's the same puzzle over and over. And again, you could begin to guess what the differences are going to be. Problems in some of these realms with these aggressive genes and different upbringings, different stabilities in families, different relationships, different role models. You can be off and running with that one. One final domain in genes and aggression, and only a handful of you, the other lecture, knew who that guy Charles Whitman was, who was the guy who climbed up the Texas Tower, all of that. Okay, so here's another chance to sort of score points in the mass murder realm. How many people have ever heard of a guy named Richard Speck? Very few. No hands. Okay. No, that's a bottle going up, not a hand. Okay. Richard Speck was once one of the most notorious people in America. Richard Speck was a nightmare sociopath who in 1968 committed a crime that just stunned the entire country. People wrote songs about it. It was just as brutal as one could imagine. He broke into the apartment of 8 nurses living in Chicago, 8 student nurses, and slaughtered them all. And this was, this was shocking on a level that's hard to describe. Richard Speck was the nightmare sociopathic murderer. So he gets sent off to prison, eventually for life, and in the process, at some point or other, he's getting some physical exam, somebody takes a blood sample, something, and a lab technician notices something interesting in his blood, examining the karyotypes, the structures of his chromosomes. And they discovered that he had an extremely rare chromosomal abnormality. Females, XX. Males, XY. Every now and then you get somebody where something screws up, and what you now get is XYY. You get an extra Y chromosome. And suddenly, this had to be the explanation for what was going on. Males are a total pain in the ass all over the world, and they've got those Y chromosomes. Oh my God, the guy has 2 Y chromosomes in every single cell. This explains it, and this suddenly started this hysteria about violence and the XYY male. Senators were bellowing in Congress about how we needed to screen our school teachers to make sure none of the men had XYY profiles. The military was all set to start testing recruits for XYY, although it's not clear if that would get you in or would it get you out, sort of how that one worked. But they were suddenly interested. Tons of work went into it, this flurry of excitement, special funding, we need to be on top of this. And by the early 70s, what was clear was there was no relationship whatsoever. So that one went down the tubes, and then in one of those ironic ending departments, it was eventually discovered that the lab technician had blown it, had done the karyotyping wrong, and he really wasn't an XYY male, despite that lab technician then having called up the newspapers. He was a normal XY sociopathic male. So that one was up there for a while. More realms of don't overvalue the genetic evidence. So that shifts us now one step further back, and now beginning to look at whole populations. Whole populations not yet on the genetic evolutionary level, but what do things like ecology have to do with levels of aggression? What does culture have to do with it? What does factors like that? And there's a really interesting array of findings out there. First off, one important dichotomy when looking at traditional human cultures is how people make their living. And the one that's pertinent here is the dichotomy between pastoralist people and everybody else. Pastoralist people, nomadic pastoralist people, these are cow people. These are people who wander around with their goats or their camels. These are the shepherds, in contrast to traditional agriculturalists, or far rarer, traditional hunter-gatherers. So nomadic pastoralists versus everyone else. And what a boatload of anthropology has shown is nomadic pastoralists have higher rates of violence, both within group and between group. Nomadic pastoralists are vastly more likely than other groups to have standing armies, warrior classes, to have leadership be derived from people who have had the most success as a warrior, to have myths built around their religion, that success in war, violent acclaim in war, is your gateway to heaven, or whatever afterlife is viewed as most desirable. This is a consistent finding, lots and lots of these cultures. Nomadic pastoralists are the ones who came up with warfare on a certain level and warrior classes. And this makes perfect sense, because one feature of being a nomadic pastoralist is you're nomadic. At certain times of the year, there's one subset of the whole village who's off 15 miles away where there's some good grazing. Another group is on the other side, and what this sets you up for is something that farmers never have to worry about. Somebody can't come and rustle your farm away at night, but people can come and steal all your animals. Warrior classes, so that at any given point, if people are dispersed, there is still a designated age group of individuals who are out there to defend the collective herds of the group. So you see that. In the United States, where that has had an interesting manifestation is where people settled in the original 13 colonies, from which part of the United Kingdom, and some very influential sort of studies, really interesting creative ones, pointing out that the American South was disproportionately settled by sheep people from the northern ends of the British Isles. In other words, nomadic pastoralists. Shifting to another realm of anthropological designation, these are people who disproportionately have come from cultures of honor. Cultures of honor, where people are willing to kill over very symbolic slights rather than over material conflicts, where there are vendettas within group, there are vendettas between groups, where it is honorific to have to avenge a death, which you do not necessarily find in agriculturalists. Cultures of honor. And that goes hand in hand with nomadic pastoralism, and what you get there typically are very clear rules about enforced hospitality for guests, and very clear rules of the circumstances of aggression, retributive ones, over symbolic affronts. And that's really clear difference regionally in this country. Interesting sociologist, University of Michigan, named Richard Nesbitt. And he grew up in the South, and I actually heard him once give a talk where he talks about how when he was about 18 or so, he left the South for the first time and joined this very strange culture at Harvard University as an undergraduate, and he was dumbfounded by how different of a world this was. People didn't shoot relatives at picnics, at barbecues, which sounded totally facetious, but when you look at the higher crime rates in the American South, it is not occurring in urban areas. urban crime is roughly equivalent all throughout the United States. It is not due to higher rates of what they call 7-Eleven robberies, which is just material gain, a robbery of that sort. It is murders of honor. It is people who know each other at social settings, people who have some insult, have something that has nothing to do with material wealth, that this is where the disproportionate violence comes from in the American South. And prompted by that, Nesbitt did one of the all-time interesting studies, this famous, amazing study. So he's at the University of Michigan, and he recruits volunteers, student volunteers, who believe they're going in to do, hopscotch test or some such thing, and they're going in, but he made a point of finding out where everyone came from, and he got a fairly even distribution between the relatively few students at Michigan from the American South and then students from the more traditional North. So they get into the psych building, each individual who's coming for their appointment, and they take the elevator and they come out and they walk down the hall. And this is where the experiment happens. Nesbitt has somebody working on the project, a Confederate on the project, I say, making a lame pun. Okay. So a Confederate on the project, person working on the project, and this was a big, beefy guy. And the whole idea was that this big, beefy guy was going to do something insulting to this individual walking down the hallway, all male. Here's what they did. They clearly did a lot of thinking in designing the study in terms of what single word this person was going to say, and this is what he wound up saying. The volunteer would be walking down the hall. Here comes this big, beefy guy moving fast, and as he comes by him, bumps into him with his shoulder, walks past and says, "Watch it, asshole," and then disappears. Volunteer comes in to start their study, and quickly they look at blood pressure and heart rate and stress hormone levels and testosterone levels, and get a typical participant in this study from the North, and they come in and they're a little bit irritated and what a jerk and all of that, and it's all over with 2 minutes later. Get people from the American South, on the average, massive stress response, hypertension, elevated testosterone levels, big regional differences. These are some of the physiological pictures of cultures of honor. What else? What other interesting things about ecosystems or ecology or cultural aspects? Another dichotomy that is really consistent, and this one maps pretty readily on that pastoralist versus everybody else, the sorts of cultures and the level of violence that are generated in cultures that live in deserts versus rainforests. And once again, deserts are where you are far more likely to find nomadic pastoralists. Rainforests, hunter-gatherers, mixture of hunter-gatherer, small farm agriculturalists, two totally different worlds of occupations. And what you see is far higher rates of violence within group and between group in desert dwellers. And that maps very logically onto pastoralists versus everybody else. Desert dwellers, open savanna grasslands, that's where you see the warrior classes, that's where you see raiding of other tribes, that's where you get that pattern, virtually none among the hunter-gatherers. I might point out something which will become sort of focused on more in a lecture in about a week or so. I should point out that desert dweller nomadic pastoralists are also the cultures on this planet that invented monotheism. Consistent difference. Desert dwellers tend more towards monotheism, and it was invented by desert nomadic pastoralists. Rainforest cultures far disproportionately tend to be polytheistic. And this is not remotely surprising. If you're living in a rainforest and there's 10,000 different types of edible plants around there, it doesn't take a lot of work to come up with the notion that there's lots of different spirits and gods out there. What the desert is about is one singular baked truth there of surviving. That's where monotheism was born. Monotheism historically is more associated with cultures that invented warfare and invented warrior classes and raiding and things of that sort. That's kind of interesting. Okay, moving on, more cultural differences. One of the great predictors of having a society with lots of violence in it and lots of warfare elsewhere is a culture that has lots of cultural myths of victimization. We have been screwed historically because of this, and this, and coupled with that, an ethos of not turning the other cheek, but instead of retribution. Cultures that have strong sort of histories and or myths of victimization and strong values built around retribution are extremely violent societies, and often really bad news as neighbors. What else? Amazing study that got published about a year ago, which is on the recommended reading list. This is not required, but this was a deeply interesting study. It was one of those game theory studies. It was a game a little bit like Prisoner's Dilemma, not exactly the same, but the same sort of notions that you could be very generous in your game playing style, you could be absolutely rationally fair, you could be exploitative, a whole range of possibilities. What these guys did in this study was take scads of people from 40 different countries. No, they didn't. From 16, 19. They took from a bunch of different countries. And just to control for things, all of the subjects were university students. So you're selecting for a fairly homogeneous bunch, both within group and across these different countries. And what they did was they had people play these games, and they had the option for what is called altruistic punishing, which we will hear more about in a little while, which is you have the option to expend some of your resources, your points, your chips, whatever, you can spend to punish the other individual for cheating. And the question, of course, becomes, how much are you willing to spend to punish somebody when they've been cheating against you, when they've been stingy, when they haven't reciprocated, all of that? First finding, which is everybody across all the countries averaged out to the same rate the percentage of resources that someone is willing to expend on punishing a cheater. So no particular cultural differences there. But then they identified another interesting realm of game behavior here, which they called antisocial punishment, which is where it's not that you are expending some of your resources to punish somebody for having cheated, it's where you're expending resources to punish someone for having been overly generous. And that pops up in certain sorts of games. It is not terribly common when it's the person who is choosing with their opponent, but when you have a third party, you have no cultural differences at the rate at which they are willing to punish cheaters. But here's where the differences came in, the rate at which people would punish unexpectedly generous players. And you got a big spread. The lowest rate at which this happened was, nicely, as it turned out, people from this country, which is kind of nice, people from England, and of course, who else? The ever-useful Scandinavians with their powerhouses of the cells and their other cliches all set. So the Scandinavians come through yet again, but for once we're able to hang out with them and actually count as having a good profile. The lowest rate of people being willing to do this not-so antisocial punishing in those countries. In between rates, number of Middle Eastern countries, a large number of Eastern Bloc countries, in other words, Slavic ones that used to be part of the Soviet Union, Korea, and Turkey. Those were the middle ones. Which ones had the worst rates? I will just read the two countries here that were way up there, a big gap between them and the rest of the countries. One was Greece, and the other were the Arabic Emirates on the Saudi Arabian peninsula, where people are willing to spend more to do antisocial punishing than they are willing to spend to punish cheaters. Extraordinary finding. People from Muscat, which was where the university was, those students were more willing to punish someone for being unexpectedly generous than for somebody cheating on a game theory social contract. Totally amazing. So what's that about? When they actually question people, you see things with people from there along the lines of, if people start doing that, of being all generous like that, it's just going to up the ante for everybody. Everybody's going to have to start doing that. That's an interesting piece of reasoning. But when you look at a larger level, what these researchers then showed was a predictor across all these different societies of the rate of this antisocial punishment, levels of trust in the society. Some standard metrics used by sociologists who are interested in this concept of social capital, how much social trust there is in the society, how much participation there is, how much of a sense of efficacy. And what you see is the lower the levels of social capital in these societies, the higher the rates of this antisocial punishment. Totally interesting study. Next, in the realm of culture. What are people doing these days? What is sort of the science and the research these days trying to make sense of terrorism and the sort of cultures that give rise to them and the sort of ideologies that give rise to them? A number of basic dichotomies. One is a camp that views it as always abnormal sociopathic behavior. Another is a camp that just views terrorism as extremes of ideology. The first one is much more about individual dysfunction. Ooh, this is a neuropsychiatric problem, perhaps. The second one is one more a feature of cultures that have extremely strong ideologies. So that's one division in there as to how to think about it in the community. Another division is really interesting, and it's one, my reading of this literature, that has totally thrown people in the field for a loop. Forever, there has been a profile, a demographic and psychological profile of individuals who are terrorists, all the way back to the people who did the Boston Tea Party in this country, the IRA, all sorts of stuff like that, the Haganah, which was in Israel, terrorist acts before independence, studied in a whole bunch of these, that there tends to be a rather consistent profile of these individuals who would be terrorists. Young, male, socially isolated, socially unaffiliated in terms of relationships, relatively uneducated background, history of childhood abuse, and another factor which has just completely slipped my mind. What was it? Oh, you all know. Okay, so that's exactly what you find in these folks, a picture of isolated sociopathic individuals who already have a history of antisocial behavior. These are people who, if they hadn't stumbled into this cause, would be spending their time mugging old ladies. That would be that profile. And you look at these various groups, and that has been a consistent one. Terrorism in the recent years, particularly Middle East fundamentalist, is a completely different profile. It is not young men. It tends to be educated, well-off people in their 30s and 40s. Overwhelmingly middle-class or upper-class backgrounds. Next, it's not just middle-aged males, it's females. It's women to a much higher extent than seen in any previous sort of population dealing with terrorism. Next, what you see is these are individuals who, on the average, tend not to have had any direct exposure to the suppression that they are fighting against. As opposed to the sociopathic model, a classic picture with IRA gunmen. The father was taken away by the whoever's, shot, never came back again, and they were passed on the family mantle. The current picture, this very different one, no direct experience of the persecution. Finally, tending not to have particularly high levels of religiosity. And this is this very contemporary profile where you get these 40-year-old engineers who are suicide bombers, where they go home, they say goodbye to their families, they make a videotape sort of wishing everybody well, and after having quit their job and paying the rent one extra month, and off they go and blow themselves up. People, I sense, in the field haven't a clue how to make sense of what this is about. Very new, challenging feature. One interpretation. One is of a school pushed by people like Phil Zimbardo here in the psychology department, incredibly influential psychologist who, as a general theme over the years, has argued for the stance that under the right circumstances, under the right coercive circumstances, virtually anybody could do anything that is appalling. Zimbardo, who did the famed Stanford prison study. The other view is, okay, this isn't a lesson that anybody could wind up being this violent if, look at them, they're an engineer and they've got a master's degree and all of that. Instead, it is simply an outcome of a lot of what terrorism is about these days, a very novel world of international terrorism. Rather than within country, suddenly you have a world of people who need to be able to do things like get passports and fly elsewhere and be able to navigate customs and things of that sort. It is suddenly selecting for a more sophisticated population of individuals. You know, the jury's out on all of this, but this seems to be a very challenging thing for that field. Okay, so now this allows us to push one step further back. I'm going to skip over a few things there. Now, insofar as we are looking at culture, and insofar as we have looked at anthropological differences, and insofar as we have looked at anything having to do with genes, we now have to talk about evolution, because that's where the genes came from, of course. So on first pass, it's absolutely simple to understand what evolution has to do with aggression, which is evolution selects for higher and higher levels of aggression because that's what you need to succeed. Unless you grew up watching certain types of television programs, in which case evolution selects for no aggression occurring because animals behave for the good of the species. Okay, so sorting through that, beginning now to imply some of our foundations from that world: individual selection, kin selection, reciprocal altruism, and the modern version of group selection. So where do these play out? First, how do these play out in terms of increasing the likelihood of aggression and antisocial behavior? Individual selection, males, that is absolutely simple. In every culture on this planet and in every social species known, in the vast majority of social species that have been looked at, the major cause of aggression in that society or species is male-male violence over reproductive access to females. That is close to a universal. That is the most common form motivator of violence on this planet, humans and otherwise. So that one's easy to come up with in terms of obvious stuff. One classic study, insanely controversial one, that appeared to be the landmark demonstration of some of the same in humans. Traditional tribe, hunter-gatherer down in Venezuela in the Amazon called the Yanomamo, who have been the darlings of sort of high testosterone male anthropologists for decades, that these have been intensely studied people, many decades now, predominantly by an anthropologist named Napoleon Chagnon, who is now emeritus at Santa Barbara, but he's been a major figure in anthropology for a long time. And these people are insanely aggressive, incredibly high rates of violence between groups, within groups, sufficiently so that there are written monographs on the Yanomamo with titles like Yanomamo, the Fierce People, things of that sort. And about 15 years ago, Chagnon published a paper in Science using decades worth of data showing that the more people, particular men in this society, in this tribe, the more people you have killed, on the average, the higher your reproductive success. That's it. That's it. That's everything right there. That's Darwin all over the place. Just play it out over time, and this is dramatic selection in a traditional human society, the reproductive rewards of violence and murder. Very major influential study, picked up by all the newspapers, and it has been completely mired in controversy ever since. All sorts of ethical sort of attacks on Chagnon, most of which that have not stuck, but some really, really telling dissections of the work, ripping it apart on statistical grounds. I don't think it's actually for real. But that as easily interpreted within that framework. Then more realms of violence, individual selection, orangutans raping each other, rape in other species, rape among humans, which of course brings up the question of whether rape is more about passing on copies of your genes or more about power and subjugation. And the overwhelming sense in the field is it's about the latter. It does not have a whole lot to do with a world where you have to start counting numbers of copies of genes and thinking about adaptiveness of strategies. Next, individual selection, explaining another realm of violence. In most cultures and in an awful lot of species looked at, the second leading cause of violence is males attacking females over denial of sexual access. And this is amazingly common all over the place, the second leading cause of violence on this planet across humans and different cultures. And obvious, easy individual selection explanation there. Finally, another realm, individual selection, the world of female-female competition and infanticide, competitive infanticide. We know how to run all of those. So lots of reasons within the framework of individual selection to see where you are increasing rates of aggression. Next, kin selection. You're going to know that one as well. 2 brothers or 8 cousins, and that whole strategy, and that's why related individuals cooperate with each other in circumstances of aggression. Chimpanzees. Chimps function where females are the ones who pick up at puberty and go elsewhere. So all of the adult males in a chimp group are brothers, first cousins, things of that sort, and thus you get one of the outcomes of that, high levels of male-male cooperation, and as we heard, that has been reported by Goodall and others to result in things that look absolutely like organized warfare and genocide, eradicating all the males in a group in the next valley over, purely along kinship lines. What else? Other primates, old world primates, monkeys like baboons, aggression is very much between lineages than within, same exact kin selection sort of arguments. So what happens when you get to humans? Things get more complicated, of course. The first one being that a relatives, is a relative term, in that it is a sliding scale. Wonderful quote to that effect, a Bedouin quote, which is, "It's my brothers, my cousins, and I against the world, and it's my brothers and I against my cousins." As in, who counts as an us and who counts as a them is a sliding measure. It is a relative measure. What you see is, by the time you get to humans, capacity for very rapid shifts of us-them along lines of relatedness. Now, one of the readings, which I can't remember now if I actually did stick into an assignment, but one of the readings looks at the classic sociobiological interpretation of making sense of aggression along lines of kin selection. What do you make of child abuse? What do you make of homicidal parents, damaging parents? How do you make sense of that in a, are you out of your mind? This is copies of your genes there, the challenges to that. And this is a couple, Daly and Wilson, who, University of Toronto, I think, who have for decades been working in this area, showing things like a child is more likely to be abused by a stepfather than a biological father. Wonder what that's about? Kin selection. That's easy. A child is more likely to be abused by a paternal grandparent than a maternal one. Kin selection explanation, more certainty of paternity when something is going through a female line. So they've done all these studies showing that degree of relatedness explains a fair amount of the variability in patterns of violence within families. Problems with it. 2 problems. One is there's been a lot of failure of replications in other societies. The Scandinavians, for example, don't see that pattern when they study it. The other is there's alternative models. There's economic models, for example. When times get tough, in terms of displacement, family violence increases. Families with stepfathers, on the average, are under more economic duress than families with biological fathers. Greater likelihood of violence there. It is a very uncontrolled literature that is sort of viewed as the classic, and in other people's view, the most ideologically extreme way in which sociobiologists think about something as bizarre and challenging as close relatives killing each other. One final realm, which is, in terms of this us-them stuff, The point here being, how do you decide who's an us and them? And suddenly we're in our world of ethology. Do we make some us-them dichotomies more easily than others? Do we have prepared learning to see some differences as more salient than others in us-thems? That remains immensely controversial subject in terms of what are the natural categories that young kids divide people up by. Are kids colorblind in terms of skin color? Are kids blind in terms of body types, in terms of some such things? Lots of work in this area. How natural are some of the us-them dichotomies that we tend to come up with? Stay tuned about 20 minutes and you will see not very natural at all. As soon as you get to humans, all this sociobiology stuff with kin selection is interesting, but as soon as you get to humans, you get to something vastly more interesting and important. Back to our recognizing relatives realm, the business of how we interact not with our relatives, but with people who we feel as close to as if they are relatives. Pseudo-kinship. And what you see in culture after culture is brilliant manipulative skills on the part of powers that be to make some non-relatives feel more related to each other than they actually are. What's this about? This is military indoctrination. The whole point, or one of the main points of military training early on, is to get people to become a band of brothers, a band of pseudo-kinship relatives, to increase the cooperativity later on, to increase the odds that you were willing to give up your life for the person next to you. Culture after culture is great at doing this. Warrior cultures, for example, the Maasai in East Africa, they have a warrior stage when you're 15. You go become a warrior, roughly 15, and you stay that way for a decade, and you protect the cows and you raid the neighbors, and once you're 25 you become an elder and get married then to a 13-year-old. But what you've got there is the entire structure of warrior life is built around pseudo-kinship. They live separately from everybody else. They use kinship terms for each other. For the rest of their lives, their wife will refer to somebody from their warrior class as her brother-in-law. Warriors are not allowed to eat their own food. They can only share their food with another warrior, all built around generating pseudo-kinship. Other more industrialized versions of it, the Israeli military, for example, allows kids, when they are signing up after high school, to join particular units as a group of friends from their high school, increasing the pseudo-kinship element there. More of that. Something that was absolutely unprecedented when you look at the difference between kinship and pseudo-kinship. World War II. The United States, hugely heterogeneous country, obviously, blah, blah, melting pot, all of that. And World War II was sort of the peak of that picture. And what you got in many, many fighting units was something straight out of central casting in these inspirational movies. There's McCarthy from Boston, and Sapiola from Philadelphia, and Kowalski from Chicago, and then the Southern guy, and the Jewish guy from who knows where. And they're all together, and they're a fighting unit, an American unity, and all of that. And what does that produce? Something that was virtually unprecedented in warfare. If you were an American soldier in World War II and you were of German, American, or German ancestry, you would, on the average, almost certainly share more genes in common with the people you were trying to kill than the people you were willing to give up your life for, as you had classically heterogeneous troops on the American side. Completely unprecedented. So this business of pseudo-kinship. Historically, Vietnam was apparently a major failure of military pseudo-kinship mechanisms, in that something unprecedented was done there, which was people were not kept in stable units, fighting units. Instead, people were constantly shuttling in and out, and you would get these nutty circumstances, apparently, where you'd be there in the middle of a firefight, and the person over here is some kid who showed up this morning, and the guy here, if he survives this, he's shipping out home to Hawaii tonight, And who feels like a brother? No one. Vietnam had an unmatched degree of breaking up unity of troops. Why was that done in Vietnam? Something that kept happening. As soon as they allowed units to remain more stable, the rates at which soldiers were shooting their officers would go way up. So another perhaps version of cooperation. Hand in hand with the pseudo-kinship is, of course, the flip side, pseudo-speciation. The mechanisms, the psychological, the propagandistic mechanisms that are available to make them seem as different from you as possible. Not just different sorts of people, but pseudo-speciation. They are so different, they hardly even count as humans. It doesn't count as much when you kill them. And endless realms of that World War II propaganda in the United States about various ethnicities that we were fighting against, pseudo-speciating, various genocides. The Rwandan one, the sort of call to arms there was kill the cockroaches, kill the cockroaches, the Hutu tribes killing the Tutsis there, and this was pseudo-speciation. Let me give you an amazing example of this, which occurred in this country not all that long ago, around 1990, an astonishing piece of pseudo-speciation that happened in this country. 1990, first Gulf War. Kuwait was slant drilling oil from underneath Iraq's land. Iraq got pissed off, invaded them, and suddenly we had the first Gulf War. The United States goes in there and to drive the Iraqis out of Kuwait, and ultimately has to make the decision of whether to follow them into Iraq and overthrow Saddam Hussein, and that wasn't done. But so this war going on. Very early on, it was absolutely clear where it was heading, which was that the diplomacy was failing, and the United States was beginning to pull together a coalition of various countries that would be a unified force fighting against Iraq. But it had not yet been authorized by US Congress as an act of war. Suddenly, into this came a woman, a refugee from Kuwait City. Refugee, she was a nurse who worked in a hospital there. She had managed to get out of Kuwait after the Iraqis had invaded, and she came and testified in Congress about an appalling thing that she had witnessed, which was when the Iraqis came in and took over their hospital, not only did they steal all the supplies, they took the newborn infants out of the incubators and left them out to die and shipped the incubators back to Iraq. Everyone was flabbergasted by this. This was every newspaper in the country. Everybody learned about this. Everybody suddenly learned, my God, they leave babies out to die. These people hardly count as human. And critically, that war was authorized by Congress by just a couple of votes of senators, and at least a half dozen of them cited this incident in helping them decide this was something that had to be done. This was a deciding factor in us going to that war. And the remarkable thing is, it never happened. The nurse was not a nurse from Kuwait City. She was the niece of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. She had been trained by a public relations firm paid for by the US government to make up this story, and she sat in our Congress on live TV in front of the entire country, lied like crazy, and we went into that war with a 92% approval rate. One gigantic piece of pseudo-speciation. My God, they leave babies out to die. It will hardly count killing them. They're hardly even human. And the coverage of when it was revealed what was actually going on with this person didn't come anywhere close to front page in any newspaper in the country. Buried down in there, virtually the entire country came out of that incident having learned how inhumane those people hardly count as human. Okay, 5-minute break. Our principles of individual selection, kin selection, reciprocal altruism begin to give us insight into circumstances where evolution should select for more aggression, for more warfare along those lines. Now the flip side, what is it in the realms of these basic building blocks of evolution that will push for more cooperation, more empathy, more affiliation, less violence? Individual selection level. We already know some of these examples, which is that whole world of alternative male strategies. That whole world of, sometimes if you're a male baboon, you could pass on lots of copies of your genes by fighting like mad and being high-ranking, and sometimes it's by bypassing all of that and being a nice guy, having an affiliative relationship, and female choice being the thing that winds up increasing the number of copies of your genes. So the possibilities of alternative mating strategies, the possibilities of course, parental behavior. And all we need to do there is switch over to the world of South American pair bonding monkeys, and those are not animals with particularly high rates of aggression. So all of those are circumstances where that could potentially be perfectly genetically viable alternatives to, natural selection selects for higher degrees of violence because it passes on more copies of your genes. Okay, kin selection. So we've just gone through kin selection insofar as it can generate pseudo-kinship and make you a better, more murderous soldier who is more willing to give up your life for your band of brothers. And conversely, pseudo-speciation, they hardly even count as humans. The flip side, of course, is ways in which the human capacity for pseudo-kinship can be used to decrease violence and to make things more peaceable and to make people feel more connected with each other. This is a ritual in all sorts of societies where you generate pseudo-kinship as a means of generating peace. One example, traditional Bedouin society. Here's what happens. You have two groups who have been having tensions, who've been fighting, who've been having some clan warfares, whatever, and they have now figured out a way to have a treaty, to stop fighting with each other. Here is the ritual that is done, which is a bunch of the old guys from each of the groups come and they sit down and they start exploring each other's genealogies. Who was your great-grandparents? Who was your great-great-great? Going through all of that. And at some point, one of them has the job of making up an imaginary relationship between the two groups. Chuck, are you kidding? I had a great-great-grandfather named Chuck also. We're relatives. A ritual absolutely transparent that people go through there to generate a supposed rationale for relatedness. A big ceremony of pseudo-kinship. Another one is seen in some Aboriginal groups in Australia. Apparently this is a motif that pops up often in Aboriginal rock art, and apparently is a symbolic version of this phenomenon. Okay, you've got somebody wandering through the great back of beyond there, and there are very few sources of water. There's a water hole up ahead. You've just walked 10 miles to come to it, and you suddenly notice a stranger coming towards the water hole from the opposite direction. And this is a water hole that is essential for you to survive. You're not going to be able to walk far enough to get to the next water hole. Maybe what you should do, just in case this person winds up being aggressive, is you should attack him first. A virtual guarantee of aggression. Here's a ritual that has been worked out instead that bypasses it. The two individuals sit down around the water hole and each starts giving their genealogy. I am the son of, who's the son of, who's the son of, and to the next bar mitzvah, whatever. Oh, we're relatives, let's share some water. They don't fall for it for a second, but it is a totally artificial mechanism of pseudo-kinship to make it possible for two strangers to share this absolutely essential for life resource and not try to kill each other. Same sort of thing, pseudo-kinship, in all sorts of historical examples of revolutions. Revolutions generating pseudo-kinship, what is often the term people use for each other after the revolution? Sisters, brothers, unite, pseudo-kinship terms. In French, for example, there's the informal two tense and there's the more formal one, and you're supposed to use the more formal one with sort of in the outside world. And in the aftermath of the French Revolution, it became illegal to address somebody, a stranger, in the formal tense. It always had to be with the familial two sense there, pseudo-kinship. More and more of it. So this brings up what is initially a really, really depressing set of studies, which turn out to have a very nice optimistic resolution to them. Very disturbing work. Work done by a number of labs over the years, most notably Elizabeth Feltz, who is at NYU. And this is work using functional brain imaging, amygdala, all of that. You put people in a brain scanner. Actually, you put one in, and you put them in one at a time. And what you do is you're flashing up pictures to them. Flashing up pictures of people, of faces at a rapid speed, so there's virtually no conscious processing. This is all tapping into subliminal stuff, and what she reported, and what has been replicated by a number of other groups since then, is that you get activation of the amygdala on the average in people when you subliminally flash up pictures of somebody of another race. Whoa, shit, that is distressing to have been found. That is not a good thing, because this is totally rapid subliminal stuff and replicated some of the best people in the field showing this. My God, the amygdala has an us-them that's in effect there in a quarter second after seeing something. This is hopeless. We are so dichotomized. This is a disaster. In the years since then, much more interesting stuff has emerged, and this has predominantly been research by Susan Fiske at Princeton, showing that it doesn't necessarily work this way. Okay, here's what you do. First version, you tell somebody, I'm going to be flashing up pictures of faces, and while you're lying there in the brain scanner, and what you do is you force them to look at the picture in a way where in a purely mechanical visual viewing, you're going to say some of the pictures have a big red dot right in the middle of it, and anytime one of those comes up, I want you to press this button. In other words, just process the picture for just a visual pattern. You do that, and the amygdala doesn't activate when you see a picture of somebody of another race. Okay, this is not very exciting. Now, the next thing she would do, get people to start thinking categorically. Here's what you do. She would now have people going in there saying, I'm going to give you a bunch of pictures, flashing up pictures, and what I want you to do is to stop. I'm going to stop at some of them, and I want you to look closely and tell me, do you think this person is older than age 30 or younger than age 30? In other words, what you have just requested the person to do is think of the face in the picture as belonging to a category rather than as an individual. You're going to look at this picture now, and you don't really need to care who the person is or what they look like or anything like that. All you need to do is think of them as part of a category. And when you bias people like that, and you flash up the picture of somebody from another race, the amygdala gets even more activated. You have primed somebody to think not about individuals, but to make them think of people in categories. Finally, what she shows is exactly the opposite. Now what she does is prime something, a totally neutral sort of priming, to try to get people to think of the person in the picture as an individual. And she asks totally innocuous, neutral things along the lines of, I want you to look at the picture. I know this sounds silly, but I want you to look at the picture and tell me, do you think, is this the kind of person who likes Coke or Pepsi? Totally sort of diagonal, orthogonal to all of this stuff. Get someone doing that, and now the amygdala doesn't activate. All you need to do in that study is subliminally prime someone to think of someone who they're about to look at as an individual rather than as part of a category, than as part of a group. This is not rebuilding society so that we change our us-thems. This is a minor prompt 30 seconds before somebody has the pictures flashed at them. That's all it took in these studies. More good news emerged, which was that you would also see, separate of these sorts of manipulations, long-term developmental aspects that were predictors of this phenomenon. People who grew up in racially and ethnically diverse neighborhoods didn't have this amygdala effect. People who had had a significant relationship with a significant other of another race did not have this amygdala reaction there. So the easy sort of solution to this being depressing, okay, early childhood, exposure throughout life, that's great. That's very good news, but even more remarkable in her studies is just a prompt. Prompt somebody to think of that person as an individual, and your amygdala is not doing an us-them with them anymore. Now, this whole business about if you grew up in a diverse neighborhood, that taps into a whole field called contact theory. The notion that aggression is decreased, affiliation is increased if people have grown up with lots of contact with people from other cultures, other societies, other religions, all of that, or if people live in contact with them. And in general, what this large literature shows is it does work that way. Contact theory, growing up in diverse neighborhoods, growing up in diverse communities, increases the likelihood of a broader umbrella of what counts as an us. That's good. Where does it not work? One realm where most of the studies have shown this is a realm that's totally heartwarming, and it would be great if it did work, but most of the studies show that it doesn't. These are the circumstances where somebody puts up the money to take some really poor Irish Catholic kids in Belfast and some really poor Irish Protestant kids in there during the worst of the civil unrest there, and they get to go to someplace wonderful and far away, and they all go to summer camp together. And they have teams that are mixtures of the kids by different religions, and they're growing to recognize each other as individuals, or the versions, lots of which have been tried, of sort of retreats or even camps for Palestinian teenagers, Israeli teenagers. These are the leaders in the future. They will go back and have learned they're not so different after all. They're kind of just like us. What those studies have generally shown is that doesn't work. It works for only a little while. You can't just pull it off on a 2-week camping trip. It takes more sustained exposure. It basically requires growing up in or living sustainedly in. So that's been a disappointment. One additional disappointment with the contact theory literature, which is one of the papers which, again, I think I put in the suggested reading. Okay, so you've got two different groups, two different populations, two different ethnicities, whatever, and they are living in generally the same area, but nonetheless segregated within group in smaller areas. One scenario, here's the region where these two groups live, and there's an absolute boundary between them. Here, instead, there's sort of an undulating boundary. It's less clear, and critically, there's more surface area, there's more interfaces between the two groups. There's more domains of experiencing people from the other group. Finally, versions where instead you have pockets of different groups embedded in other ones, and that being a completely different scenario where in fact you maximize the perimeter that you get there. And what's been shown in this one study that I recommended that you guys look at is the more contact, the more interfaces between the two groups and living situations doesn't guarantee that people will get along better. What you will find is there's intermediate points where the contact profile increases aggression. Because what it does is you just barely have a critical mass of people on your side to be an effective group to fight with them. You see totally different outcomes depending on the spatial characteristics of the subgrouping. And what the people showed in this paper was they then analyzed the different ethnic distributions in the Balkans, the Bosnian, more the Croatians, all of that, and seeing that this was extremely predictive of where the violence took place in terms of where you had what they viewed as the least optimal set of interfaces of contact between groups. More contact is not necessarily always equal more understanding, and we're all just the same. More contact can equal, in some cases, more irritation and more resources and more unity to do something about it. Okay, more of pseudo-kinship. So this whole notion, again, of pseudo-kinship, we are a species where we're not recognizing individuals by smell, all of that. We're doing that cognition stuff, but don't forget the kibbutz study, but we're doing that cognition stuff, and thus we can do pseudo-kinship, and thus we could be manipulated by powers that be, by governments, by religions, into viewing non-relatives as more related to us and all of that. These are very abstract processes. And it brings up another realm, an extremely abstract realm, that pushes for more cooperation and less violence. And this goes back to what I was talking about the other day, the neurobiology of symbols, how we code for certain types of symbols, certain metaphors in our brain. And that's back to that whole world of you're using the same part of the brain for disgusting food and moral disgust, warm drink, warm personality, that weird concrete literalness, because you got to put metaphors somewhere. When humans started developing them, the outcome of that being that metaphors can be extraordinarily powerful. And a number of researchers, probably the person most visible in this realm, an economist at the University of Michigan named Robert Axelrod, has been doing a whole lot of work showing, in a sense, the importance of symbols in peacemaking. And it makes perfect sense. You take the extreme rationalist view of humans as economic machines, and what peacemaking is going to be purely about is figuring out contested resources and how they are going to be divided up. And what Axelrod and others show instead is this whole irrational realm of be respectful of somebody else's symbols, and figuring out how you're going to divide up the land suddenly becomes a lot less important. The power of symbols over rational contested resources. And he studied things like how a critical thing that happened in peace coming to Northern Ireland was at one juncture a bunch of the Sinn Féin, however that's pronounced, the ex-military wing of the IRA, that were just beginning to have extremely mistrustful negotiations with some of the Protestant sort of unionists and all of that. They did something outrageous. They sent a 50th wedding anniversary gift to this guy, Ian Paisley, who was the murderous head of the sort of Protestant death squads there. Somebody just decided to try this, and this was a massive breakthrough. Anyone who saw that movie Invictus or have read about it, the utter brilliance of Nelson Mandela, of having spent his time in prison learning to be completely fluent in Afrikaans, so that when he was sitting down and starting to negotiate with these people, the fact that he could sit there and speak in their language, a language that is so laden with symbolic importance to Afrikaners, that was a gigantic symbolic coup of Mandela embracing the sport that was the very symbol of apartheid, of Mandela doing very subtle things that a number of people pointed out who were involved in the negotiations. Okay, Mandela, just when he has gotten out of prison and he's about to meet with some of the leaders of the government and some of the most right-wing opponents to any sort of peace, and so we need a conference room. And no, that's not what he did. He insisted they would have the meetings in his home that he had just returned to. Okay, well, let's clear off the dining room table. No, that's not what he did. He would insist they did this in the living room, where they would sit down on stuffed armchairs and couches. And something that he did apparently always at these is he would sit down on the couch and gesture to whoever was likely to be the most impossible foe and say, come sit next to me. Sit next to me on the couch. And would proceed to jump up at various points to say, can I get you some more tea? Do you want some more? There would be food, there would be biscuits, there would be whatever. Brilliant, brilliant use of symbols. If I'm sitting here and this guy keeps jumping up and getting more cookies just when I was getting a hankering for some more cookies, maybe not so different after all. People who get cookies for other people make the world more peaceful or something or other. What Axelrod has also shown in some of his work is the potential for it. Really interesting stuff. He will, for example, he and people working with him have interviewed, say, Hamas leaders in Palestinian in the Gaza and the West Bank, some of the most sort of opposed to the existence of Israel, most confrontational groups, and he gets quotes from their leaders along the lines of, if the Israelis would ever once just say, we got screwed in 1948 and we're sorry it happened, we would be willing to make peace. And then he goes and talks to some Israeli generals, and who are some of the most right-wing ones, he selects them for that, and they sit there and they say stuff like, if the damn Palestinians would ever just get the anti-Semitic garbage out of their school books, we'd be able to think seriously about peace the next day. It's not about water rights. It's not about return of land. It's just about, are they going to respect our symbols and the legitimacy of our history and the accuracy of it? Enormously potentially powerful interventions there. Okay, so kin selection, most importantly, pseudo-kinship. Moving on now, reciprocal altruism. Where does that come in terms of potentially making for more peace? And what's clear is, in principle, it should never do it if you're playing only a single round of a game with someone, a game in the prisoner's dilemma sense, because there's absolutely no reason to cooperate, because you were never going to face the person again. And this is something that was called by the zoologist Garrett Hardin the tragedy of the commons, in a circumstance of shared resources but limited responsibility and limited repeated interactions. You have to select for selfishness. You have to select for what is termed a Nash equilibrium, where the only possible rational thing to do there is to not cooperate. So how do you ever get cooperation to evolve in groups of organisms? So back to the same Axelrod, his work with computer tournaments there with the tit for tat, seeing that under some circumstances one of them can dominate. Tit for tat is a great optimal one. In the real world, though, how do you ever jumpstart cooperation? How do you ever get one of those strategies going when the starting state is complete lack of cooperation? We already know one example, which is founder populations. That whole business about get an isolated population, has a higher coefficient of relatedness inbred, out of kin selection, establish high degrees of cooperation, they come back, and it's this group selection phenomenon of you better become as cooperative as them or you're not going to be able to compete. You can see the same exact thing in circumstances where it is not a founder effect of a population goes away for a while and then comes back, but where a population is functioning in that way amid a sea of non-cooperators. In New York City in the 1980s, there was this totally weird phenomenon in that there were two ethnic groups that were moving into New York at a much higher rate than in the past, Korean immigrants and Lebanese immigrants. And both groups happened to gravitate towards grocery stores. The Korean community, fruit, vegetable stands, the Lebanese community, more regular old grocery stores. And they were incredibly successful. And these popped up all over the place, and the people who already had the fruit and vegetable stands and stuff started complaining that they were at an unfair disadvantage. How come? Because these Korean shop owners would cooperate with each other. They would give each other interest-free loans. That's not fair. That's not fair that they're being nice to each other. We can't compete. And the same thing with the Lebanese grocery owners, that you had people doing reciprocal altruism in a community of trust, and what they were immediately doing was out-competing the non-cooperators. And amid these bizarre demands for like banning Korean fruit and vegetable stands or somewhat, like this was a point of great hostility during that period in New York City because those people were cheating. They cooperated with each other. So either join in or you will be driven to extinction. So that is one possibility. What are the other circumstances in formal game theory play that favors the emergence of cooperation? Critical one, repetition, that you're going to play against this individual more than just once. If it's one time, it's tragedy of the commons. There's absolutely no reason to select for cooperation. Repeated interactions, and it opens up the possibility of you being punished for being a cheater. what they call the shadow of future retribution. One qualifier with that, though, you need to have multiple rounds of interactions, but it can't be a known number of rounds. You can't know how many rounds it's going to be. Think through this. You know that this is the very last round you are going to play, and what's the only logical thing to do is to cheat. The very last round functions as if it was a tragedy of the commons single round game. So the only logical thing to do is to cheat in the very last round. In which case, the only logical thing to do is to cheat in the next to the last round, and the next to the last. A known number of rounds of interactions immediately does in cooperation because it sort of flows backwards with this collapse of the system. Next thing that favors it is what is called open book play by people in the business, which is you will be playing against a number of different individuals and pairs cycling through, and the critical thing is when you begin to play with someone else, they can know your record as to how you played in previous games. In other words, once you bring in reputation. When reputation can be possible, suddenly you select for cooperation. Next, what's shown is that if you have people playing in multiple games with each other, especially when they're unsynchronized, you select for cooperation as well. What's this about? What you do is, if one of the games makes it very, very easy in terms of payoff for cooperation to get established, if you intermix rounds of that game with a game in which there is very little motivation for cooperation starting, what you see is a psychological bleed over. If you're cooperating with this person in this game, which is now done here, now done here, it greatly increases the odds of when doing the other game of beginning to cooperate as well. Multiple games, and it does not take much to see that this is more like the real world than playing prisoner's dilemma with one single individual. Next, the possibility of punishing someone when they are a creep. And that's what we heard about before, what is termed now in the field altruistic punishment. If somebody does something crummy to you, you are allowed to expend a certain amount of your resources to take more of the resources away from them. That selects for cooperation. Something that even selects faster is second-party altruistic punishing. You're not taking part in the game, you're watching these two individuals, but you have the power to use some of your resources to punish a cheater. An outside enforcer, that selects for cooperation even faster. Then, something that is even more effective, which is termed secondary altruistic punishing. Here's what you do. What you do is people are observers of other people's interactions and seeing if they're cheating, and they can do some altruistic punishment if they think this individual's a jerk and all of that. But here's what you do if there's a circumstance where somebody cheats and this third-party individual doesn't punish them, they get punished. What's that about? That's honor code violations. That's the expectation that you are supposed to report someone who has had an honor code violation, and if you don't, you will get punished. That selects for cooperation really fast also, and all of these have been computer tournaments and all that, that world of research by now. Finally, more subtle stuff, give the person the opportunity to drop out of the game, to secede from the game. Give the person the opportunity to not play against you, but to choose, I'll play against all these other individuals, but not that one. Begin to put that power in there, and you select for cooperation that much faster. So that's some good news. Final level at the group selection level. Group selection not in our behaving for the good of the species, but as we know, the more modern version of it, selection for traits that are only manifest at the level of whole groups. A always loses to B, but groups of A always defeat groups of B. All of the stuff we've been seeing, people suddenly cooperating with each other as a small group and driving the non-cooperators out of business, that's a group selection argument going on there. So you can have that as a means for generating a lot of cooperation. That's great. That makes the world a better place unless there's a downside to it. And back to chimpanzees. What do you have when a bunch of related chimps are having not individual fights with males from the next valley over, but functioning as a group? You are having an example of group selection, which thus brings up one of the most profoundly scary things on this planet, which is when you got a bunch of males who are getting along well with each other and they're beginning to look at the neighbors. Because lots of males cooperating together can make for some very bad neighbors, as some people in the field have emphasized. A decrease in homicide within a group is a prerequisite for inventing genocide between groups. So group selection is not always this magical founder effect of everybody wanting to learn the new folk songs. What you've got instead are circumstances where it can go very wrong. Final amazing example showing the emergence of cooperation. And this was not a game theory demonstration. This was not an experiment. This was a real event that happened, and an extraordinary one. This occurred during World War I. A lot of people have heard about a phenomenon that happened there, a historical incident that was very, very cool, but pales in comparison to what I'm about to tell about. In 1914, the first Christmas of World War I, somehow the decision was made that there was going to be a truce on Christmas Day. All of the fighting up and down the trenches was going to cease for 24 hours, and as has been documented, it was amazing and bizarre. Men out of the trenches playing soccer with each other from different sides. A bunch of German and French guys playing against some British and German guys on the other side. People exchanging gifts. People exchanging helmets as souvenirs. People singing together. People getting drunk together from the two opposite sides. And eventually, when the officers got them to go back to their job, they returned to trying to kill each other. Amazing, bizarre incident. What was very striking about it is it extended actually 2 or 3 days extra, longer than planned, because the officers couldn't get people to stop doing this. That's very cool, but that's an outside force already establishing the cooperation. Here's something much, much more impressive. And this happened in World War I, and it didn't take a bunch of generals or heads of states to negotiate a truce. The way in which truces would spontaneously emerge over and over again across the trenches. How do you generate a reciprocally altruistic cooperative relationship with the enemy in the trenches over there, where you don't speak the same language and you don't even see their faces? Here's what you do. You take your best gunner and have him come up and lob a shell 20 yards behind the trench there and blow up a tree. Now have your gunner lob a shell to hit the exact same spot again. And do it again, and do it again, do it a bunch of times. What are you communicating to the other side? This guy's really good, and we're choosing not to put the missile down on top of you. What are you going to do about it? And then the other side would get out their best gunner and do the thing in return, and you have just worked out a non-aggression pact. And this occurred over and over again in the trench warfare, documented in letters by soldiers back home to parents saying, "Hi, Mom and Dad, things are okay here. I hope you're worrying less because we've worked out something. Things are a lot better here. There's a lot less people getting hurt." Working it out along those lines, working out a tit-for-tat vulnerability where you had to have a forgiving tit-for-tat. What if somebody messed up and accidentally dropped a shell into the trench on the other side? They got one shot back. Letters. "Dear Mom and Dad, things are okay here. We had an incident the other day. We had this new gunner who didn't really understand how things work, and I heard he killed 4 people on their side. They shot one back. They took out 3 of our people, but everything is okay now." Tit for tat, complete with a forgiving element. This happened again and again and again in the trench warfare, and the only thing that stopped it from spreading is the fact that the officers kept insisting that nobody else was doing this, and these guys were going to get shot and court-martialed if they didn't stop this. And if they had only had cell phones, if they only had communication, if they only had a way of knowing up and down the line that everybody was doing this, they would have stopped the war. not with a treaty, not with generals, not with heads of state, not with diplomats, but simply a bottom-up way of evolving cooperation, and they would have stopped the war if they knew that they weren't the only ones wanting to do this. Amazing historical incident. Okay, so this gets us to the end of aggression. As you probably noticed, this has gone on way long. This is the longest amount of material we spend on anything in the course, and each year it actually gets longer, and I actually think I know the reason for it. 3.5 lectures ago, where did I start off talking about my recent exposure to human aggression, which was my doing it and tripping up that jerk playing soccer, and everybody was all excited. Let me tell you about another time, the most serious time I have ever been exposed to human aggression. This took place when I was about 20, and this was the first year that I was doing research in East Africa. During that time, the famed notorious dictator Idi Amin was running Uganda, and he was a nightmare. He was just killing people left and right, destroying the country, as documented, cannibalizing. He was a nightmare of a dictator. Around the time, he made a mistake. This was spring of 1979, which is he invaded Tanzania and took over some of the land there, thinking the Tanzanians wouldn't fight back, and he miscalculated. The Tanzanian army counterattacked and drove them out of Uganda and decided to drive all the way up to Kampala, the capital of Uganda, and they overthrew Idi Amin. He fled the country, and the country was liberated. They continued through there, and they opened up a corridor to the Kenyan border, so it was now a swath all through the southern part of the country that was controlled by Tanzanians. So the day after the Tanzanians got things to the Kenyan border, I went into Uganda. Okay, why? This was like amazing. This was history happening. You were hearing, like on the BBC, that people were dancing in the streets in Kampala. They had been liberated. Amazing chance to see history. This was throughout college. I had been spending a lot of time with Quakers and wrestling with those issues, and figured if there is anything that counts as a just war, this would be it. What does this seem like? All these philosophical principles. This actually, of course, was not what was going on. I was a 20-year-old male, and somebody had been staying with me and no longer was, and I was all bummed out, and thus I did sort of a very 20-year-old male adolescent primate thing, which is figuring some violence would do some good things for my brain neurochemistry, and I wanted to go see a war. So I went off to Uganda, hitching through there, and it was appropriately exciting, and some things happened that scared the bejesus out of me. And at some point, I finally decided I have had enough. I want to get back to Kenya. I want to feel safe again. So I'm hitching back, but I had one last thing that I want to do, which was, since I was a kid, I had grown up reading about the explorers and the search for the source of the Nile and all of that. The source of the White Nile is in Uganda. It comes out of Lake Victoria in a town called Tororo, and there's a spot there, a bridge, where you can go and stand, and here is where the Nile River begins. And I had to see this before leaving, and I managed to get a ride into there, and I managed to get over to this bridge and stood there. And there was this sort of dam thing that was built, that this bridge was on top, and there was this sluice where all the water came spritzing out and starting the Nile, and I stood there and I looked over the side, and what I saw was there was a Ugandan soldier who had been taken down. There was a staircase along the side down to some sort of panel for controls or whatever, and a Ugandan soldier had been taken down the steps, his hands tied behind his back, and a rope tied around his throat and attached to the panel, so that as the water level rose, he would eventually be swept off his feet and would be strangled and drowned in the water. And this body had obviously been there for days. It was bloated. It was floating there. It was being bashed around on the waves. There were crocs trying to get at it. And looking at this guy, a total storm of emotions, thinking, good, that's what you deserve, we're being in the army for Amin. Then thinking, no, wait a second, this is probably some poor guy who was forced to do it and was just following orders. Then thinking, no, I know what I think of soldiers who just follow orders. Then thinking, whoa, I would love to get a lot closer and see what's happening down there, and thinking, I want to get as far away from here as possible. And I stood there for an hour and a half at that spot, staring at this guy until some Tanzanian soldiers chased me away from there. And I think now, 33 years later, that I lecture longer and longer about aggression each year because of that guy. What do we do here in our business? We have this general notion that if we are rational, if we are learned, if we are scholarly, if we respect thoughts and truth and all of that, we will make a world a better place. All of us who are professorial have somewhere in there this totally ridiculous belief that if you're allowed to lecture at a subject long enough, it will give up and go away, and that will be the cure for world aggression. If everybody can only be lectured to about the frontal cortex, it will solve world violence. But the basic problem is that aggression is such a messy set of behaviors. Schizophrenia, no question about it, bad news. Alzheimer's disease, childhood cancer, global warming, all of these unassailably bad news. But aggression is a whole lot more complicated because of that point where we started with, which is the same exact behaviors, and depending on the context, it could be something that will get a medal for someone you will want to mate with, vote for, reward, cheer on, join in, and in another setting, it is the most frightening possible thing that can happen to us, and it's the same behaviors in all those cases. And it's for that reason that violence is always going to be the hardest subject for us to understand biologically, and it's for that reason that it's always going to be the one we have to try hardest to understand.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.